Hello, and welcome to another Eduro Learning Live event. This is the Shift Key podcast, and my name is Kim Cafino. Thank you so much for being here with us tonight. We hope you are well this evening or whenever you happen to be listening, and we're excited to hear from you during this podcast. So please feel free to chat with us live while you're watching, or if you're watching this recorded, leave a comment and share your thoughts and ideas with us. We always love to hear from you. This week's topic is essential thinking strategies for digital fluency in today's world, and was inspired by our last podcast. So if you haven't listened to that one yet, listen to that one first and then come back here and hear what we're thinking about when we talk about essential thinking strategies for digital fluency in today's world. And today I have a bunch of special guests with me, like we do every time we have the Shift Key podcast, and I'm going to ask each of them to briefly introduce themselves along with where we can find you on the internet. And I'm going to just call you out one at a time, and I'm going to start with Clint.
Oh, great. Hi, my name is Clint Hamada, and I am currently at the International School of Beijing. And if you want to find me on Twitter, I am at Chamada.
Nice. And then can we get Cynthia and Liv?
Hi, my name is Liv Van Ledgy. I live in Durham, New Hampshire, and you can find me on Twitter with my handle @TheLivets.
And hi, I'm Cynthia, Liv's mom. I'm a staff developer from Durham, New Hampshire, and you can find me at Cindy Subu.
And Keri-Lee.
Hello, I'm Keri-Lee Beasley. I'm Director of Digital Learning at GEMS World Academy in Switzerland. Look me up on Twitter at KL Beasley.
And Pana.
Hi, I'm Pana Asavavatana, and I am at Taipei American School. You can find me on Twitter at Pana Asavavatana.
And last but not least, Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Madrid. I am at Yokohama International School, and you can find me at NBBecca.
Awesome. Well, that's everybody for today. We're going to get started and have a chat. And I guess I will start us off with a question prompt. What do you guys think are those thinking skills or strategies that are necessary for today's world so that, you can just kind of pick up a device and run with it, create something, be meaningful?
I'm going to speak up here because Cynthia and I have been discussing part of this. It's not the whole picture, but we've been discussing this for a long time now. And a huge thing that we've been talking about is icons, actually, and their frequency in which they pop up across tools, devices, new apps, old apps, and even in the everyday world. And that literacy, I think, is key because the ability to read a symbol or an icon and understand its function, or at least predict its function, is one that can at least take you a few steps into a new device, a new app, a new tool. And unlocking that skill, I think, is something that we need to embed a little bit more into our classrooms, because it's very similar to the way we teach young children to read pictures in the books. It's not much different at all, but we just need to make that transfer, I think, into a wider range of texts.
That is such a good point. And I know what you are saying is much deeper than what I'm about to say, but it just makes me think about how the floppy disk is still like the save symbol, but that doesn't resonate with anyone any younger than me, basically, which means almost no students have any idea of what that floppy disk is. So there is even some explicit teaching that has to go with those icons because they make sense to the adults who design them, but not to anyone kind of growing up today.
Exactly. I hate having to point to that thing and attempting to explain to the kids what it is.
I think you were going a long way with things like the Noun Project and Flat Icon and, this whole idea of trying to create symbology across languages that can be represented. And they put them out there for everyone free to use with attribution for the most part. And I think also, I don't know a whole lot you design for Google and for other sort of web kits. There are certain basic needs that they require. So I think it's there, but what's missing is that explicit teaching. At times that I never really made the connection until you just said it, Pana, about we teach kids how to read a picture book by you look at the picture, then you try and see what's going on, and then you read the words and you see if you understand those words, and then the picture will help you understand the words that you maybe don't know how to read to begin with, right? Maybe you've seen them, but you've never heard them or you've never read them yourself. How do we teach kids to look at it, or even adults to look at a screen and go across, okay, view, insert, like I know what all of those things mean in Microsoft Word. Can I make that connection to what they mean in Google Docs or in whatever other thing I happen to be using? And are there those consistent imagery? So, oh, yeah, that's just in some other app. You know, what happens when I click that?
Right. I think that one thing that I've been saying more and more, because I do work with such young children, is that I usually name the thing that I'd like them to do. I'd say like, wait a minute, I need to take a picture. Can you read the screen for me and tell me if there's anything on the screen that can help me do that? Instead of telling them, tap the camera and take a picture.
I think it makes it really a lot more accessible too. If you think about, a lot of us work at international schools and we've got kids that are coming from all of different backgrounds, reading the images does make a lot more sense. And I think just giving, like you said, Panna, giving them the opportunity to have a look at their screen and not giving them the answers like click here, then here, then here, which is perhaps what teachers used to do. Now to say, where do you think we need to click? And what's going to happen if we do? I think there's probably the people that find it most difficult are the teachers, because they know you do this and then that and then this. But the kids, they just play around with it and they don't seem to worry too much about whether or not they're going to click the wrong button. You can always go back.
That also makes me think about, and I know I'm steering it a little bit differently, so please come back to this, but it makes me think about the skill of like hovering your mouse over an icon to figure out what it does, and how for many people that's not intuitive at all. Like they feel like, I don't know, they don't know that pause moment to just hover your mouse over the icon and see, is that going to tell me some further information? So even that is like a very simple, discrete skill, like reading the pictures, that we can teach to help kind of build that fluency between apps or tools on a computer, maybe not so much on a mobile device.
Well, actually, no, Kim, like that's reminding me of when Liv explained her difficulty of shifting from a touchscreen to a laptop, because she didn't know the gestures. Even if you have a trackpad, there are multiple gestures across different, branded devices even. And do you have enough of a repertoire of gestures to trial and error when you receive a new device? And that's the type of thing that, I can see a lot of kids struggling with as well, without any guidance.
Well, it's like right click. Right click is so embedded in my brain because I've always had the need to right click things, but younger people don't need to right click. It's not a thing, right? So like even teaching the right click versus the left click. And if you're on a Mac, it doesn't automatically have the right click in there. So you have to set that up. Yeah, right? The two fingers. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell me more, Panna, about the idea of reading a screen versus, telling a kid take a picture or record your voice or whatever? Why would you use the language of read the screen versus something
right else? Well, I usually do that because I'm trying to have them make the connection to what they're learning in reading. Because a lot of the times, like Clint was mentioning, we say to younger kids at least, like, if you don't know how to figure out a word, look at the picture. Maybe the picture is going to give you some clues. And then you try and match that up with maybe the initial sound of that word to kind of create a system or a bunch of strategies that children use to unlock a text. In the same way, I'm trying to get them to build habits that become then strategies that hopefully they'll use over and over again as they come across new apps that they have to use. And so reading the screen, then they're practicing scanning the screen in a way that's systematic, looking for clues that make sense to them, that sort of thing.
I would say actually, I would say actually thinking about kids reading a screen, I think about Charlotte, my kindergartner, and how much she jumps into any sort of app with what I would consider to be fluency if I were to compare it to reading, although she's not a reader yet, or she's a beginning reader. School-wise, on an app, she's actually quite fluent. She doesn't have any fear to navigate something very quickly. And I would say actually it's the opposite for teachers that I work with, that it's almost like reading becomes a little bit of an inhibitor to be able to figure out something more quickly, whereas Charlotte will just jump into the app and figure it out very, very fast. I think adults want to know exactly how it works at first. They want to know the meaning, whereas Charlotte's not looking for that. She's looking for like trying to figure something out and having fun. An adult that I'm teaching might be like, I'm not sure what you mean. Bring me back. How do I click there? What is, and actually sometimes even take notes, which I feel like isn't what the huge experience of like being on a device is about. You don't need to take notes, like just think your way through it. And that's, I think, something that's intuitive to Charlotte. So it's very interesting that with young children, I feel like sometimes the act of reading and reading the pictures is much more intuitive than it is to read, than it is for adults who are already readers. And I wonder sometimes if that's what causes the most issues.
And I'm thinking, like, where is that transition happening from being fearless with it to being more inhibited? Like, what's the next step? What's the next step? Because I see my middle school saying, I'm not good with technology. I'm like, I don't even know how that's a sentence. Like, it's like saying I'm not good at all of those things that they are good at, that they struggle with, that are difficult, that are challenging, but they think about technology the same way that they think about researching. I'm not good at researching. Well, no, you need to learn how to use it better, more efficiently for what you need now versus what you needed when you were 5 years old. So how can we make sure that they don't stop in middle school, high school, where it is getting more challenging, the level of skill or what they need to read or how much they have to delve to create, first, so that they don't stop there and continue to be fearless. And they're not the adults writing the notes. The next step is what?
Cynthia, you said a phrase that think your way through it. And I feel like I want to unpack that a little more. And I know I interrupted somebody, I'm not sure who, but I feel like that idea of like thinking your way through it, what does that look like for an adult? What does that look like for a child? Are they different? I would be really curious to just talk about that.
I think one of the things to think about when I'm saying think your way through it is that for Charlotte, as a 5-year-old, she's growing up already with the mindset of understanding how to be digitally literate. It's just part of like her life. So when you have access to a device, I think she doesn't think about any kind of fear with it because it's just another tool that she's using, just like a book is a tool. And I think maybe the shift for adults is that we're not growing up. We haven't grown up with that. And so working with adults, it's much more difficult because it's their mindset around the device and around the device work. So I think the shift is because of maybe lack of practice and wanting it to be a tool that works all the time exactly the way you want it to work and not wanting to have to think through or troubleshoot. So for Charlotte, she doesn't think about it as the act of troubleshooting. She just does it because it's a mindset. It's a tool for her that's natural. And for us, I feel like we're, or at least the adults that I work with a lot, they're wanting it to work correctly and properly. It's why they're taking notes in case it doesn't work, so they can go back to their notes and figure out how to help somebody. Whereas Charlotte doesn't worry about that. The fearless thing is that this is part of her mindset. She just understands how to use it. And when she doesn't, she just keeps going. So it's almost like a book. Think about that. If it's a picture book, it can have multiple meanings. You can have multiple ways to interpret the text. It doesn't have to have just one way. The author might have an intention, but you, the reader, bring something to it. And so I think that that's the same way with tech. We bring something to it.
I think teachers are really good at doing that with reading. So they're thinking, when I'm reading this, I'm thinking, blah, blah, blah. I'm wondering this. They're really good at modeling their thinking when it comes to reading. They don't seem to transfer that to things like, and when I'm searching, I'm going to use quotes around these words because, or I'm going to filter these results to the most recent, or any of those sort of things. So I think they're very comfortable in the literacy sphere, but also even if you just transfer that to the to the digital reading, how much time do we spend actively teaching the digital reading strategies, like use a 3-finger word lookup or any of those sort of techniques that we can do the modeling of thinking.
I just was working with a group of middle school students, and they were creating their own activities on Seesaw, and I don't know if any of you have ever done that, but you can actually insert their icons in your activity. And the coolest part about doing that work with kids, so they were making activities that they could share with each other and around the science work that they were doing. And I think the coolest part was one student suddenly, student was like, this is like baby coding, because the the seesaw, when you're actually doing the words, you're just typing in, colon, file, colon. And then when you preview the activity, the icon comes up. And so at first when they were doing that, they weren't really realizing that, yes, the icons were going to pop up. And the student having this sudden moment of realization, the whole class like stopped and they were like, whoa, this is cool. And then they went right back to it. There was this great moment of like realization of how easy the coding could be. And I think that after that, they were like, we have to do this more. So I think even like having adults have that experience or to watch students in that act of like realization as they're doing something. It's like simultaneous, and it was really cool.
It's still making me wonder, how do we teach and I want to come back, like beat a dead horse on it, but how do we teach the think your way through it, especially to adults? But I think it's equally relevant to what Rebecca is talking about with the kids who think they're bad at technology. And I just keep coming back to adults because I'm working with adults mostly now. But that idea of like making rational choices and observing what's in front of you and coming back to your previous experiences with a similar tool, like all of those processes that I think probably all of us go through rather fearlessly because we feel so comfortable with technology. Like when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about Snapchat, because Snapchat is a tool I still am not very good at. And so I'm trying to like relate these skills back to something I feel not confident in. But what are the explicit skills that anybody, adults or students, need to know to be able to kind of think your way through it so that they become fearless because they know they can think their way through it? I think that's my question.
I wonder if we keep defaulting to this is easy as being a good thing. Like, just because technology, if being used well, in some ways should be hard if the thinking is of appropriate level. Like, there should be some challenges that come, not necessarily with the techie bits, but with the level of thinking that you want to put through and to be okay with that, to be the first time you get a search, you put your search terms into Google, it's not going to work. And it's more tricky to put it around quotation marks. And kind of own up to like, yeah, these things are more difficult than we may like, but that's because we're doing some deep creative thinking, and that's not always seamless and easy. It's not seamless and easy in books. It's not seamless and easy in our writing or when we create something analog. Like, why would we expect technology to be easy if we're doing good thinking?
That is such an interesting point, Rebecca. I feel like I've been noticing that a lot lately, that because if you don't really know what technology can or can't do, because you think it's like magic, you almost always expect it to be easy, but sometimes it just like it doesn't do the thing that you want it to do. And that's just where we are with our ability to do things, Interesting.
That's not a bug, that's a feature, right? Like that's
right.
Like that's where the learning happens, is when things are difficult and when things don't work out right. And so it's not teaching people the tool, it's teaching people the thinking of how do you overcome when things don't work, and what learning comes from that.
I think too, the language the language of the workaround, that helping kids understand that just like when you're reading a text, it has complexity, and that when you're with tech, it's like finding the workaround. To me, the think your way through it is, okay, so this messaging didn't work, but what other messaging could you use? So I can't text this person, but I could message them, on Twitter. Or it's like, I do feel like kids actually have a lot more in their repertoire of workarounds sometimes than adults. They just don't always see that as valuable. So maybe some of the think your way through it, or the I'm bad at tech, is because they've had experiences with adults that have been verbalizing, I'm bad at this, or haven't used tech in ways that are innovative. So they get this message that tech is always going to work perfectly. And so I think Liv has talked about that in her own classroom when something doesn't work. And what does your teacher say?
It's usually whenever like something doesn't work, you have to raise your hand, and then for the rest of the class does it. Because they think that when you're in middle school, you learned in elementary school to use all these tools that you don't need any help anymore. So,
or just that the idea that when you're on tech, it's actually naturally more collaborative. So you don't have to sit and raise your hand, like turn and like ask somebody. And I think that even with a text.
But then they say not talking to other people. So then you kind of have to be talking to the teacher because you can't be collaborative with other people.
Right. So I think that's one of the things to think about. Maybe even it's also how we set up the structure of the classroom, whether or not kids are willing to do the workaround or to think their way through it.
Yeah, because if the teacher says, no, you need to do it the way that I was taught by this consultant who came 2 weeks ago, and you need to do it exactly that way, because they're like, no, but I've got another way. Are they allowed to do that way?
And I think that comes back to the digital fluency piece again, too, is that understanding that there's a million, maybe not a million, but there are many ways to do the same thing. And all of those ways are totally fine. You don't have to do it the way I showed you or somebody else showed you. You can do it your own way and still get to the same end result.
I think sometimes teachers are just not aware that they're not modeling those strategies as well. I think it would be quite simple to say, hey, have you thought about modeling how you navigate an app, or how you do a Google search, or how you find an image that's licensed appropriately? So just getting them to talk through their thinking. I think if they know about that, then they'll be more likely to do it. They've been quite receptive if it's been suggested in my experience.
Yeah, me too. I know when I was doing more classroom coaching, I would always have at least some lessons that were about making the implicit explicit, I think is the way I usually phrased it. And I have a blog post about that too. And I would talk to the teacher about, like, what are the things that you need students to know and be able to do with this specific tool? And then we talk about, like, oh, how do I know that I can click this button because I move my mouse over it and the hand appears? You know, all those little things that are just kind of part of our everyday practice, but maybe need to be taught, especially at different kind of year levels. And I definitely think if teachers have, like, hear that that's something they can be doing with their kids, they are totally receptive.
I do think the work in literacy and about how kids think their way through when they're learning, to talk about their own thinking in a text is a really good model for how we begin to talk about kids with tech. And that Howard Gardner and his team at Project Zero at Harvard do a lot of work around making your thinking visible. And I think that is supernatural mostly for teachers in the reading area, in the literacy area, but not so much I don't think they make the natural transfer to the tech piece. And it is, to me, just another way to be fluent and another way to read. So it would be great if there was more work with teachers around that.
So you do like a see, think, wonder with the
Right. I think, though, that yes, they haven't had that ability to really shift their mindset to make that transfer. But at the same time, I think that sometimes we need to remind teachers or adults that we're working with that they've spent their entire lives becoming fluent at reading print. The tech hasn't been around that long, and they need to be patient with themselves and understanding that they're kind of going back to their younger selves in learning to think through the tools that they're being placed in front right now. So they're but they're not going to be as confident as they feel with a book, and the way that they can just be like, oh yeah, I can talk about my thinking about a book, because they've been doing it since they were like at least, 5 or 6. They haven't been doing it for that long with tech, and the tech keeps changing. So in a way, you're never going to be that confident, and you need to be able to get comfortable with the fact that you're not going to be that confident.
If Clint doesn't unmute his microphone right now, I'm going to be so upset. I know he's having connection problems, but I was fortunate to work with Clint for 2 years, I think, face-to-face, or 3 years. Anyway, we had many wonderful moments, but one of my favorite moments was this one time, and I'm going to get it wrong, and I don't even know, Clint, if you know that it was one of my favorite moments from working with you, but it was a teacher who was questioning the value of time spent creating a tutorial, because it takes the kids so long to record themselves and then edit their recording. And Clint made such a good point. He went right back to, well, of course they can write that so much easier because they're in grade 7 and you've been teaching them since grade 1 how to write a sentence, how to write a paragraph, how to explain their thinking. So they're really fast at writing things by hand, but now this is the first time they've ever done it in video form. So it's going to take a little bit longer. And I remember when you said that, Clint, I was like, oh, yes. Yes.
I have my moments.
Yes, you do.
That'd be great if that's all you said all podcast.
Bye. I've been listening, like Kim said, and other people said, I had some connection problems, so I'm a bit laggy, so I don't want to jump in and talk over other people. But I think that idea of making that transition and making that link between kind of traditional literacies and these traditional fluencies rather, and these digital fluencies is really important, because people see them as sort of apples and oranges, where, you know, maybe in the actual act of doing it is different. But I always try and think, and we always try and talk about, yeah, but what's kind of the conceptual understandings that are underlying all of that? And it is that ability to notice what's going wrong. It is that ability to be adaptive. It is that ability to be able to kind of go with the flow and not stress out. You know, we have kids who are like that when they read as well. They can't read the book, so they just close it and they walk away. And we coach them to, like, how do you work your way through that? We have kids who do that when they write. We have kids who do that when they play basketball or when they're in PE, and like, how do you kind of help bring down that tension and understand what you're actually trying to accomplish, and then recognize the small steps to getting towards that goal. I think someone said it earlier, people see technology as something that's kind of magical and it should always work. And, you know, why don't they just make something that just does this already? I'm like, well, if it was that easy, somebody would do it, don't you think? Like, there must be something that's hard about it. So how do we figure out what's that workaround? How do we figure out what's the thing that we're really trying to accomplish and get there? And help people see all of those little steps, because they do just think, oh, well, it's a computer. I turn it on. It's always on. It always works. But it's how we're using that computer or that tool or that app or whatever to get that end result. So many times we don't know what end result we want. And so how do you teach somebody to be fluent if they don't know what they're actually trying to do? And bringing it back to that original point, I think, too, is super, super key for a lot of teachers. And then also to make that really apparent for those students. Like, we're not making an iMovie. We're trying to show what we know. Oh, okay. I might use something else. Yeah, cool. Knock yourself out. I'm going to mute again.
I'm curious, Liv, you haven't said anything this time. I know we haven't asked you directly, but how do you feel when you pick up you told us a little bit about when you transitioned from a mobile device to a laptop and how that was kind of stressful for you because everything was so different. How do you feel when you're learning something new on technology? Do you feel like, oh, I can just figure it out, this is not going to be a problem? Or do you ever feel intimidated? Or like, I know it's really hard to articulate what are the things you're doing when you get a new tool in your hands. What are the things that you're thinking?
Well, usually they don't let us, we usually wait and like listen to them. They usually tell us like a step-by-step tutorial up front on how to get to this like assignment. And then they say, okay, go off and do it on your own. But usually that takes like 20 minutes, so then kids start to forget. Mm-hmm. And so then kids end up going to all these different places and that they're not supposed to. Then they try asking other kids that still don't know. So then it's just a lot of, and so then you have to work your way through it. You have to try to think about all the different ways, and it doesn't have to be the same way that like you get on, like us, I forget who was saying that, but it doesn't have to be like the same way. You can get it on any way that you want.
How do you feel? How do you feel when you do that? You're going to work your way through it. Are you feeling confident?
I'm feeling confident about it, because then usually when I'm completely stuck, I'm not like.
And what about?
Try to figure out. I try to go back and think what I said, or just go from what I know already and try to get to.
I want to ask you a question that I know is going to be like impossible to answer. I'm going to try it anyway. If it's impossible, you just tell me it's impossible. When it's something that you're stuck on and you feel like you really don't know, are there any things that you think in your head like, oh, I've done this before and this is how I did it? Or are there any things that go on in your head that make you able to work your way through it?
Mostly just like little positive little sentences like, I can do this, you got this, come on, go for what you know. Think, don't bang your head on the keyboard.
Nice. A positive attitude goes a long way.
Don't rage.
No rages. Are there things, Liv, you do when you're working on a device, like for thinking, like you do that's similar to what you do when you're in a book? Like when you come to a word you don't know in a book? Think about how that. Not sure.
Not really sure. Sorry, that's the impossible question.
But I think that's exactly what we're trying to figure out, is what are those skills? And teachers are so confident and knowledgeable about those skills when it comes to reading and writing and math and all of those subject areas. But what are those skills when it comes to digital tools? What are those fluency skills that maybe Liv actually has, but she is not able to articulate at this moment in time because it's not something that they talk about?
But like that.
But you know what? I do think she does things that she's not aware of. Like just yesterday, she asked me about a word in a text in a book that she was reading. And it was like, she said, I know this part means this. And so it's almost like, and she does that when she's using different apps. She'll say, oh, this is like this reminds me of this. So I think it's like the micro that she actually intuitively is sort of thinking about smaller bits of things that she knows from another app or from another whatever she's working on. And she does that when she's in a text, when she comes to something that she doesn't know. She thinks about something in a more, like tries to figure out something more in a micro way. So I think if we could figure out some of the ways to name that, right? Like
yes,
the connection between that. I think that's the link. It's like linking those micro steps. And in reading, we have those already sort of figured out. And maybe they're even very similar. Maybe that's part of what we should be thinking about is how is that very similar to the things that kids do in reading?
I was wondering that as you were thinking about it. I was like, decoding, that's one example. And that's what we do. I don't think that they're very different at all.
I mean, go from what you know, think, don't rage is a pretty good strategy for anything. Like,
or going back.
Put that on my wall. Like,
the last
like, you can do that with a book. You do that with your iPad. I think it's pretty solid strategy you got going on there, Liv.
Thank you.
That could be the title of a book, Don't Rage.
Yeah.
Successful affirmations to use in your head whenever you're about to rage.
I like
a t-shirt. Sure.
Good.
Whenever you're raging.
No, not to rage.
I know. It's like that.
I think the idea of taking some of those micro skills and making parallels would be really interesting. I wonder if that's something, maybe not next podcast, because I know we have an exciting idea for next podcast, but I wonder, I don't have like a list of those literacy skills, but I have a feeling that there's people on this call that probably have access to a list of literacy skills like that. That might make a really interesting conversation, 1 or 2 podcasts down the line.
I'm even thinking like for us as an MYP school, like the approaches to learning skills, almost all of them we could transfer into a technology realm.
Yes.
Like you take evaluate interpreting data as critical thinking skills. What does that look like in a tech? Like that already exists for us as a world, as a language.
Yes.
And to some extent, I mean, that was always encoded in the ISTE standards. I don't know about the most recent version, but that technology operations and concepts has always been about that, making connections between existing applications and new applications or novel ideas. I'm also thinking about one of the things that Kim and I used to always do whenever we handed out iPads to a new group of grade 7 students was you just gave them 10 minutes or 5 minutes just to kind of go and explore. But I don't know if we ever explicitly then brought that back and said, okay, well, what did you learn or what connections can you draw? Because I think maybe hearing the connections that other students make to be like, oh yeah, when I'm using this app, it reminds me of Snapchat. And kids be like, oh yeah, it's just like Snapchat, right? And helping them make those connections. Like I won't always make the same connections that they do because I don't really want to get into the minds of 7th graders. But at the same time, to hear them and help them make connections with one another after having that little exploration time, right? And they're going it from a different perspective than myself. Maybe that is also one of those kind of fluency skills of just bringing together maybe 2 disparate ideas actually and finding the middle ground between them so that people can go, right, okay, I don't quite know exactly how to use it, but I get a better idea of where I'm going with it.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just jump in. I think I like to do that kind of sandbox time where people come back and share the things that they saw. But you're right. I don't remember. I think we were so pressed for time with those iPad launches that we probably didn't even consider like any more like conversation. But I think that's a really good strategy for kids to be able to make connections from things they already know. Because I think that's what we're talking about. We're talking about that literacy. We're talking about that fluency. We're talking about being able to move from app to app, device to device, and making the connections is what helps you do that.
And transfer is an incredibly difficult skill. Like it developmentally, it comes really late. Like the idea of transferring ideas between classes, between what you're learning, between like all of those things. So you have to make it super explicit, like because it developmentally, I think it's late teens, early 20s where it really solidifies. So like,
but it is a skill, and it is something that can be taught, and it is something that can be learned, and it is something that can be encouraged. It's not something that's magical in some people and absolutely not in others, right? It's something that we can encourage. And I think that's something that we sometimes forget.
We assume it's going to happen. And then we're like, why didn't the kids make the connections? And you're like, well, their brains aren't there yet. Like, let's help them develop those pathways.
But that's also the same thing about this fluency. I think everyone can get up to a level of digital fluency that is one that doesn't impede their work progress as long as they practice the skills. But if you don't know what the skills are to practice, it's really hard to practice them.
And I think making those connections for teachers, hey, this is just like what we do in reading. It's just we're doing it digitally. It's going to make the digital part less scary or less intimidating potentially.
So I think this is an awesome project for us to work on in our next podcast, because I think it would be really interesting to just kind of actually bring in the MYP approaches to learning, to bring in some literacy micro skills like Cynthia was mentioning, and just kind of actually have a conversation about each of those and what they look like in a digital environment, because that might help make that connection, like Clint was talking about, between two disparate ideas, make that connection, make that transfer really easy for teachers, because they're really confident in teaching what evaluate means in the MYP, but maybe not so much in a digital context. So I feel like that would be a really cool next podcast. What do you guys think?
Next.
Yeah.
Awesome. Then I say we wrap up our conversation here for today. And I thank you all for being part of this conversation. That was amazing. And I would like to let everyone know that our next podcast is going to be awesome, because it's going to be hosted by Liv and feature the children of our advisory board, which is super cool. So they're going to have a conversation about learning today, like as kids, and we're going to get like a little sneak peek into that here on this podcast. So please make sure to join us next time, which will be sometime next month. We'll announce that when we know a little bit closer to the day when it's going to be. Please join us for our next The Shift Key podcast, hosted by Liv, our very own student advisory board member. And if you'd like to find out more about our podcast or about Eduro Learning or the kind of work that we do, please check out edurolearning.com. Hope to see you there, and hope to see you again next time. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.